Welcome to this teaching, which I've titled The Measure of a Man. Now, when I say man, of course I mean man or woman. But the fact is that we are always measuring, all the time. What are we measuring? We're measuring ourselves and we're measuring others. It was earlier this year, I happened to be over in Europe. I was in Sweden. And I was sitting and I was talking to a gentleman that I had recently met. And one of the things that the conversation turned to, because he was an engineer, was the subject of measuring. In the United States of America, we measure using a British measuring system. We have inches and we have pounds, yards, things like that. Whereas over in Sweden, they measure according to the metric system, where everything is divided by 10. And he was making the point that our measuring system was pretty archaic and very difficult, and he just had a lot of difficulty understanding it. Whereas myself, having been raised in this type of a system, the metric system sometimes causes me some difficulty. See, when you're going to measure, one of the first things you have to understand is what's the standard, because that's what measuring is all about. In fact, when you're measuring, the most important thing is that there is a standard that's developed. To ascertain the quantity or the quality or the amount of anything, measuring involves a comparison of what it is you're measuring against a fixed standard. And as I mentioned earlier, we're all measuring, and we're measuring all the time. Again, what are we measuring? We're measuring ourselves and we're measuring others. The problem is our measurement right? Are we using the right standard? In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, Jesus actually brought this up, and he said in Luke chapter 6, verse 41, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take that speck out of your eye,' when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, then you can see clearly and remove the speck from your brother's eye." See, the point is that we're looking all the time. We're measuring all the time. I'm always, whenever I meet another person, and so do you, whether you're aware of it or not, every time we meet someone, we kind of try to gauge ourselves. Is this person in a social rank above me, or are they equal with me, or are they lower than with me? You know, the problem is that not are we measuring, but how are we measuring, and what's the standard? There's a few options that I think I've thought of when it comes to the subject of measuring. Number one is, am I measuring myself against others? Which I am, and if I'm doing that, I've got to be really careful, because I know I'm measuring myself according to other people all the time. I see friends of mine that are very effective teachers, and then I look at that and say, wow, I really wish I could teach like that. There's nothing wrong with emulating other people and seeing their achievements and desiring to do similar things and being inspired by it. But if I measure myself wrongly according to other people, it can also cause me to get depressed, maybe sometimes dissatisfied with what I'm doing, and maybe what I'm doing is not wrong. Another problem with measuring is sometimes people measure themselves according to themselves. I don't believe that's the right standard in certain applications either, but at certain times it could be right. For instance, if I'm measuring myself against myself in determining that the standard of holiness is me, that I get to determine what is sin or what is right, or morally what is acceptable, now that's probably a slippery slope in a place that we don't want to go. Yet on the other hand, I'm only being measured against myself. I can only do the best that I can do. So we have to be aware of when we're measuring ourselves by ourselves and when not to measure yourself by yourself. Another thing that we have to be aware of is measuring ourselves according to God's standard, because that's the bottom line. That's the only standard that really matters. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done in the body, whether good or bad. See, we are all going to be measured. But the measurement that really counts is the measurement when God takes the tape and measures our lives. That's the one that's going to make a difference. And be careful how you measure yourself. Are you measuring yourself by yourself, according to yourself, and allowing yourself possibly some liberties that you shouldn't? Or are you measuring yourself according to God's standard? Because again, that's the only ultimate measurement that really is going to matter. Sometimes I've gotten pretty depressed. I've gotten beat down when I hear the opinions of other people. I allow them to get into my heart and to depress me at times. That's wrong. Then I'm allowing someone else to measure me. The only measurement that matters is really God's. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, the Apostle Paul even said, "We dare not to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they're not wise." See, you have to be careful. Are you allowing some things in your life to get by because you're doing the measurement of yourself? Or are you going to the standard of God according to His Word and using that as the standard for measurement? In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3, there's a great section where the Apostle Paul, when confronted by people who were challenging him, he said, "I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself." See, that was a man who was in tune with the proper way to measure. He didn't care what other people and how they measured him. He was more concerned with the fact of how God measured him. And he even says, "I don't even judge myself. I don't even measure myself." Verse 4, "My conscience is clear, but that doesn't make me innocent." See, even though his conscience was clear, he realized that a clear conscience just means that he could be measuring himself by himself. And he didn't allow himself that liberty. He goes on to say, "It is the Lord who judges me." When we measure ourselves, when people get down on you, the fact is, if you're doing what God wants you to do, you're going to take some heat for it. You're going to get persecuted. You're going to get measured by the world. And the world's going to tell you you're not good enough and you're coming up short. Don't allow others to measure you. And don't allow yourself to measure yourself. Seek for the Lord to judge you. When's the proper time to be measured? I think of a tree. I came from the West Coast, and out there we have redwood trees in the Sequoia National Forest. These trees can grow 200-300 feet tall. They're monstrous in height. When's the proper time to measure that tree? Would it be when it's a sapling? Absolutely not. Would it be in its mid-lifespan? Definitely not. The only time to measure a tree is when that tree is chopped down and it's laying on the ground, because that's when it's done. That's when it's over. The only time for you to measure yourself is like what Paul says. I'm not measuring myself. I'm not allowing others to measure me. I'm going to let the Lord measure me. Keep in perspective that your life is not over till it's over. Let's go to Acts chapter 13. Because remember, we talk about the prophet David, the King David. And David made a lot of mistakes. But I love in Acts chapter 13, verse 26, where the testimony of God of this man who had been a king, absolutely, and a man of great faith and a man of praise, but also a murderer, also an adulterer, also a very negligent father at times. But yet the testimony of God concerning David is this: "For when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep and was buried with his fathers, and his body decayed." David served God's purpose for him in his generation. And it says that David was a man after God's own heart. Don't measure yourself according to others. Don't measure yourself according to your standard. Stand faithful to the day that you can stand before the Lord and hear His judgment. And I pray that His judgment for you and for me will be, "Well done."